Okay, class, today we're going to talk about comparing data displayed in dot plots. Dot plots is another kind of graph to display our data. Okay, before we get started on that, we're going to look at a few vocabulary words that you will need to know when you're dealing with dot plots. And these words may be familiar to you. We're going to review those. We have the median, the range, and the mode. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is the median. The median is the number that is halfway into the set. Okay, so we have a list of numbers. If we listed out numbers here, if we listed 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Our middle number is the one that is halfway into the set. So our middle number here would be 3. And the way we would do that is we look at the first number, last number, first number, last number. This number here is in the middle. So 3 would be our middle number, which would be our median. Now, a way that I have my students remember that is small, medium, or median, large. Okay, think about the shirt sizes: small, medium, large. Median is in the middle. Or you can think about in the road, when you're driving down the highway, what separates the two lanes is called the median. So it's in the middle. Okay, the next one is going to be our range. The range is the difference. It's important. The difference between the highest and lowest values in the set. And the first thing you need to do before you figure out your range is to order the numbers from least to greatest first. That's very important, because when you do that, it puts them in order, and now you can find the range. Range is how spread out it is. Okay, so you subtract your maximum, which is your greatest number, and your minimum, which is going to be your smallest number. So maximum minus minimum. Okay, and remember always to order the numbers from least to greatest. Okay, next would be our mode, the number that occurs or appears the most often in a set of numbers. And the way I have you remember that is mode is most, the one that appears the most often. So if I were to write a set of numbers down here, 1, 2, 3, 3, 3, 4, 5, 6. The number that appears the most often would be 3, because there's 3 of those numbers. Okay, there's 3 number 3s. So now, here we have all of them here, and I'm going to pause and I'm going to let you get that copied down really fast. Okay, so the main thing to remember when we're dealing with dot plots and doing the data is the median, which is the number that's halfway into the set of numbers. The range is the difference between the big number and the small number, or the maximum number and the minimum number. Mode is the number that occurs or appears the most often, so the one you see the most of. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn on the inside here. And we're going to compare dot plots visually. Okay, visually means we're just going to look at them and we're just going to write down what we see, what we notice about these two. So here it says visually compare the dot plots of the scores for 25 science tests to the scores for 25 math tests. So here, we're just going to look at this data really fast before we even start doing anything with it. So you see our science test scores and you see our math test scores. Okay, I'm looking at how many I have. There were 20, 30, and so forth. Okay, so for 70, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That means 6 of the scores were 70. So in dot plots, you either have either dots or sometimes you'll see them as X's above that number. Okay, so now we're going to visually, we looked at it. So now as a group, what can we conclude about these two dot plots? Okay, so I'm going to pause here and I want you to talk with your partner really fast about what do you notice about these two dot plots and compare the data in those two. Okay, so what I'm going to be looking for is, let's look at how spread out the data is. Where do most of them lie? Where the test scores look like? So as a group, the science test scores are lower than the math test scores. Now, let's see why I said that. So let's look at the science test scores. So we know that the higher the grade, the better. So let's look at how many grades are below 70 on the science test. So on the science test, you have more that were below 70. On the math test, you have more that were above 70. So that's how, as a group, we just did that visually. We can see that the math test scores were higher than the science test scores. Okay. Now, let's look at the spreads. So when we talk about, when you hear the word spreads, that means the range. Okay. So how spread out is our data? All right. So let's look at science. Science test scores. So let's look here. So I see that it's spread out. The range of my test scores is from 20 to 90. Okay, just that simple. So we're going to write the spread is from 20 to 90. So how we're going to write the spread is from 20 to 90. So that's how spread out they are. They're spread out from 20 to 90. So now, let's look at the math test. Let's see how spread out they are. So the spread on the math test is from 30 to 100. I'm going to write that. The spread is from 30 to 100. Okay, now we haven't calculated anything yet, but let's look at this. So if I were to actually calculate the spread here, we could say that they're the same. Because remember, it's for the ranges are, you subtract the largest number from the smaller number. So if you do that here, you get 70. If you do it here for math, you get 70 as well. Even though the data is spread out, the ranges are the same. So we're going to write that here. We're going to say the spread is the same .70 points. Okay. So now let's look at the centers. When you hear the word centers, we're talking about the median or the middle numbers. Okay, so let's look at science here. So where does most of your data lie here? The center. What's going to be the middle number? So I can do this one or two ways. I can say, okay, let's start here. 1, 1. I can cross out 30, 90, 30, 90, 40, 90, 40, 80, 40, 80, 40, 80. I can go back and forth and cross out one at the beginning and one at the end. Now, when I come to figure it out for science, it's centered around 70. But if you just look at it visually, you can tell that most of your data, the middle number is going to be 70 because that's where most of your data is. So now we're going to write that down here for science. The data is centered around 70. Okay. And for math, we know the data is centered around 80. Okay, so when you're looking at dot plots visually, all you're doing is looking at it, figuring out where does most of my data lie? What's my range? Okay, what's the middle number? And it's easy to see that with just looking at it here. Now, let's go over to comparing dot plots numerically. So now we're going to look at how we do them numerically. All right, so now we have a different set of examples here. So we're going to numerically compare the dot plots of the number of hours a class of students spends on homework to the number of hours they watch TV each week. Okay, so we know television, just by knowing you guys, television may be a little bit more, but let's see here. Let's see what they say. So let's look at our dot plots here. So first I'm going to look at it visually. Let's look at it. Let's try to figure it out. I'm going to pause here for a second and give you a chance to talk with your partner. And what do you see is, what do you see right off the bat that stands out? Okay, so right off the bat here, I can tell you I have one over here that's all by itself, and we call that the outlier. Okay, the outlier can either affect our data in a major way, or it may not affect it that much at all. Okay, outlier is that thing that's all the way over there by itself. Okay, now we visually looked at it. We saw, hey, that may affect it. We looked at our homework, how many hours. Looking at our television, how many hours. Okay, so now the shapes. So the shapes of our dot plots. For homework, where does most of the data lie for homework? So if we look at homework here, we see we have one over here at 4 hours, 2 at 6 hours, and we see that most of it is going to be more than 10 hours or greater. So let's write that down for homework. So for shapes for homework, most data 10 hours or greater. So we're just going to write that. Most data 10 hours or greater. It's that simple. Okay. So I numerically put a value to my data that I'm talking about here. So now, what about TV? Where does most of my data lie for television? Do you want to talk with your partner? Okay, so you should have said something like, okay, we see we have the outlier here. Maybe this one person here that doesn't really watch TV. Okay, then you have a few at 10, one at 12, but most of my data is 16 hours or greater. That's what I'm going to write. Most data (16 hours or greater). Okay, so we just examined the shape of it. Okay, the shape of our data. So now we're going to talk about the centers. Now remember what that word centers mean. Centers means the median, so the middle of our data. So let's look at homework. So what's going to be the middle? I'm going to pause here and give you a chance to talk to your partner, discuss what is the middle of our data for homework. Okay, so with homework, you should have said something like the median is 12 hours with most of the data to the median. So let's look at homework. We said the median was 12. So most of our data was around the median, which was 12 hours. Okay, so now I'm going to pause here. Let's look at television and tell me what you notice about the middle number of the median for television. Talk with your partner. Sorry about that. Talk with your partner. Okay, so with your partner, could have been something said as the median is 16 hours. Okay, the median number is 16 hours. And even though there's an outlier there, it does not affect the median. Okay, sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. But the outlier here doesn't affect the middle number. Okay. So now let's move on to spreads. Spreads is, of course, again, the range. So how spread out is my data? Okay, so let's look at our graphs first. Okay, and let's look at the spread. How spread out? What's the range of my data? Okay, so for homework, what is the range? How would I calculate the range? Okay, so I'm looking at, it's the minimum and the maximum, and we're going to subtract them. So the maximum number is 18 and the minimum is 4. So the range for homework is 14 hours. And I got that by taking 18 and subtracting 4. Okay. Now, the next question is talking about the television. Okay. Now, television, I want you to give me television range with the outlier and the range without the outlier. Go ahead and do that with your partner. Okay. So for this one, we're going to look at with the outlier first. So if I take into consideration the outlier here, I'm doing 20, which is my maximum, and my minimum here would be 0. So with the outlier is 20 hours because we're doing 20 minus 0. Now, without the outlier, it will be 10 hours because we're doing 20 minus 10. And we got that we got that by not including the outlier. So we would just look at this data here. So we would just do 20 minus 10. That's excluding the outlier. So here we can say that it greatly affects the range. So you see how the outlier, it affects the range here. Now, I'm going to ask you a question here, and I want you to talk with your partner. So which piece of data or which measures of central tendency, which are, excuse me, median, mode, range, which one of those does it greatly affect, or which one do you think it does affect and which one do you think does not affect? Okay, so we just concluded comparing data displayed in dot plots. And remember, median is the middle number, range is the maximum minus the minimum, and mode is the one that occurs the most often.